50 historical lies you believe because of movies. What if most of what you know about history came from movie props and lazy scripts? You've been taught fake facts so often they feel obvious, and you still repeat them. Let's fix that. I'm debunking 50 of Hollywood's favorite lies fast, with receipts and the real story that actually makes the past way more interesting. We'll smash the Viking horn myth, the pyramids built by slaves trope, and Einstein's fake report card. And there's one movie lie you almost certainly repeat without thinking. I'll close that loop later. Let's start with the oldest lie Hollywood can't quit. 1. Ancient Egypt, not what movies sold you. Here's what actually happened at the pyramids. They weren't built by endless chains of whipped slaves collapsing in the sand. Archaeology dug up workers' villages right beside the Giza Plateau, stone barracks, bakeries, breweries, cattle bones, bread ovens, and medical care. Names of rotating work gangs are literally carved in the blocks. These were skilled laborers on rations and housing, organized like a national infrastructure project. Enslaved people existed in Egypt, but the plantation-style chattel slavery you see in films is a totally different system, much later and elsewhere. Most people think Cleopatra was a native Egyptian queen. She ruled Egypt, yes, but she was Macedonian Greek, descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals. That doesn't make her less Egyptian in practice. She was the first of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language and present herself to Egyptian audiences as a traditional pharaoh. Politically, she was sharp, fluent in multiple languages, negotiating with Rome's power brokers, running a complex economy. The stereotype of a seductress manipulating men ignores the reality that she was a multilingual head of state navigating an empire next door. Let's talk about curses. The mummy's curse took off after 1922 when Tutankhamun's tomb was opened and newspapers needed drama. They cherry-picked some untimely deaths, ignored that most expedition members lived long lives, and spun a supernatural story that sells better than archaeology, involves dust, cataloging, and a lot of patience. Ancient Egyptians feared desecration and wrote protective texts, sure. But the Hollywood idea of a death sentence for opening a tomb is a modern media creation. The pyramids weren't random piles either. The Great Pyramid is aligned to the cardinal directions with jaw-dropping precision. Its sides are within a tiny fraction of a degree of true north. That level of accuracy took careful surveying, sighting stars, and rigorous logistics. You're looking at a civilization that moved millions of stones across organized ramps, causeways, and work teams, not chaotic crowds yanking ropes while a villain shouts. Makeup wasn't just glam, that iconic kohl around the eyes. It helped reduce glare in sunlight and may have had antibacterial benefits thanks to lead-based compounds prepared in very low concentrations. Combine that with ritual meaning and social signaling, and you've got something more like a health, status, and religious toolkit than the purely decorative movie version. And yes, Egypt had slavery, but the category was broad. Debt servitude, prisoners of war integrated into households, and corvée labor obligations appear in records. It wasn't a uniform system across 3,000 years. Treating slavery in Egypt like a single monolith is like compressing every labor contract from the 170s to today into one law. Movies flatten nuance into a whip and a chain. The reality is administrative tablets, contracts, and social hierarchies that shift across dynasties. Now the logistics. Do you ever notice how films show a heroic architect pointing at a cliff and the next scene is a finished pyramid? In truth, the supporting infrastructure was the real star. Nile flood schedules, quarry timing, river transport, ration distribution, and seasonal labor cycles synced with agriculture. When the Nile flooded, farmers couldn't sow, so the state redirected labor to national projects and fed them. That's not cruelty. That's a clever use of downtime to build something that still dominates the skyline. Another quiet myth, that Egyptians were technophobes stuck in ritual. They were obsessive measurers and record keepers. Rope stretchers resurveyed fields after the river shifted boundaries. They developed copper and later bronze tools, stone pounders, sleds with water-lubricated sand to reduce friction, and clever levers. The movie version shows brute force, the real version shows human ingenuity. Microstory, a visitor to the workers' cemetery expects starved, broken bodies. Instead, osteology shows healed fractures, evidence of medical care, and repetitive stress patterns consistent with heavy work, plus enough protein to keep them going. When you feed, house, and treat workers, it's because you value them. Gladiator owners in Rome did the same with fighters. Egypt did it with builders. One more, the desert isn't a blank beige backdrop. The Giza Plateau was a humming hive, quarries ringing with copper chisels, ramps crawling with hauling teams, overseers tracking stone tallies, bakers turning out thousands of loaves a day, brewers filling jars of beer as wages. The mystical lone pyramid vibe works for cinema, but the reality is an industrial-scale project city at the edge of a metropolis. Finally, Cleopatra again, because the casting cliches won't die. Her ethnicity gets argued to score modern points, but the evidence is thin for anything beyond her Macedonian lineage. What we can say with confidence: she cultivated an Egyptian identity politically, leveraged Greek culture administratively, and dealt with Rome pragmatically. Reducing her to a romance subplot erases the policy moves that kept Egypt independent as long as it was. Once you understand that Egypt's wonders came from organized labor, precise measurement, and pragmatic statecraft, not curses and chains, the whole story sharpens. Head north, the next lie wears a horned helmet. 2 Vikings, horns, hygiene, and Hollywood. Most people think Vikings charged into battle wearing horned helmets. They didn't. There's zero archaeological evidence for horns on helmets from the Viking Age. The few horned headpieces found in Scandinavia are Bronze Age ritual items, not combat gear. The horned image took off in the 1800s when opera costumers wanted a dramatic silhouette. It stuck because it looks cool on posters, not because it ever showed up on a longship. Here's what Vikings actually wore. Simple iron helmets with a rounded or conical cap, sometimes a nasal guard. Mail shirts, shields, spears, axes. Practical, repairable gear for people who were sailors first, fighters when needed. And that brings us to the next myth: Vikings were not just frothing raiders. They were traders, settlers, and lawmakers. They founded towns like Dublin and York, ran thing assemblies where disputes were settled, and managed property rights with contracts. Raiding happens when politics and opportunity align, but the day-to-day was commerce and farming. Hollywood paints them as filthy brutes, yet Viking sites turn up grooming kits all the time. Combs carved from bone, ear scoops, tweezers, razors, toothpicks. There are even accounts from their neighbors grumbling that Scandinavians bathe too often. Weekly washing on Saturdays shows up in sources. Think about it, sailors living in close quarters can't function if everyone's covered in grime. Hygiene was social strategy as much as cleanliness. Women had more legal agency than you'd expect from the movie version. Viking-age women managed farms, inherited property, and could initiate divorce in certain circumstances. Those keys you see on women's belts and graves, that wasn't random decoration. Keys symbolized authority over household stores and economic decision-making. It wasn't a modern democracy, but it wasn't a lawless patriarchy where women had no say. Agency existed inside a known framework, and it mattered. Berserkers, films show an army of shirtless, permanently frothing warriors biting shields and ignoring pain. The reality is narrower and more debated. Berserker appears in sagas as a specialized role, sometimes royal bodyguards who might have used ritual chant and altered states before battle. Were substances involved? Possibly, but the evidence is thin. What's clearer is that Berserker behavior was exceptional, not the default. Most fighters needed coordination, shields aligned, spears timed. You can't row a ship, land, form a shield wall, and raid a monastery while everyone's blackout raging. Navigation is another place where the wild luck myth falls apart. You'll hear about sunstones, optical crystals that can polarize light to locate the sun through clouds, and yes, there's experimental support that it works. But even without that, Viking sailors mastered coastal pilotage, reading currents, bird flight paths, whale routes, and the color of water to judge depth. They used latitude sailing by sun height and held memory maps in poems. You don't hit Iceland, then Greenland, then North America by accident twice. Microstory: a reenactor once told me, "You can't run in Viking kit." Then a museum team had volunteers row, disembark, jog burden, set a camp, and strike it all in replica gear. The result? Manageable. The gear was built for movement because movement was the job. That's the thread Hollywood drops: practicality. Horns catch rigging, excessive metal tires rowers, poor hygiene spreads disease on long voyages. Survivors optimize. Another sticky myth is that Vikings were a single, unified people. In reality, Viking is more of an activity label than an ethnicity. Going Viking meant a raiding or trading expedition. You had Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Islanders, and diaspora communities with local variations in style, law, and politics. Some settled permanently, intermarried, and blended cultures. That's why you find hybrid art motifs in places like the Danelaw, knotwork meets Anglo-Saxon forms. Let's hit religion quickly. Movies either make them cartoon pagans or proto-atheists. The real religious world was layered: Norse myths, local cults, oath rituals on rings, ship burials for elites in some regions, and constant change as Christianity spread. Conversion took generations and looked like pragmatic adoption: elite alliances, trade ties, and flexible rites, less overnight temple burning, more dual practice until the church, courts, and kings enforced uniformity. Violence? Yes, but structured. The famed Blood Eagle likely isn't a literal ritual performed on the regular. It reads like saga-era literary horror. Real violence was tactical: ambushes at river bends, fast strikes on poorly defended sites, hostage-taking for ransom, not endless slow-motion duels under thunderclouds. And in legal sources, compensation payments and feud regulation mattered more than theatrical finishing moves. Why does the horn myth survive? It's a costume designer's dream and a brand logo. But once you understand that Vikings succeeded because they were adaptable, farmers who could become sailors, traders who could become warriors, you see why they left such a wide footprint. Their secret weapon wasn't horns, it was logistics, law, and seamanship. One more quick correction: they didn't vanish. Their descendants became Normans, ruse elites, and citizens of the kingdoms they helped shape. The culture morphed as all living cultures do through marriage, treaties, markets. That continuity is why you can still trace legal traditions and place names back to longships. So drop the horns, keep the combs, and remember the keys at the belt. From longships to legions, the Roman lies are louder. 3. Rome, thumbs, vomitoria, and gladiators. Most people think a gladiator's fate was decided by a cartoon gesture, thumbs up for mercy, thumbs down for death. That's not how Romans signaled. The sources are murky, but pollis verso just means with a turned thumb, not which direction. Some evidence suggests a closed fist with hidden thumb could mean mercy, while an extended thumb mimicked a sword and meant finish him. And crucially, the editor's decision wasn't a crowd-pleasing coin flip. It weighed the fighter's performance, the sponsor's finances, and the event's reputation. Another stubborn myth, vomitorium equals a fancy Roman puke room. No, in amphitheaters and theaters, a vomitorium is an exit passage that spews out crowds quickly. It's about crowd flow, not digestion. Romans absolutely indulged in feasts, and some texts mock gluttony, but the architecture term got twisted centuries later into a gross joke that refuses to die. You can tour surviving stadiums and see the vomitoria, arched corridors designed to move tens of thousands in minutes. Gladiators weren't disposable meat. They were investments. Training a fighter took months, even years. Diet, conditioning, technique. They fought under rules with referees carrying long staffs to separate clinches and stop illegal strikes. Most bouts ended before death because dead fighters don't sell rematches. Inscriptions and medical evidence show healed injuries consistent with repeated, regulated combat. Yes, deaths happened, but often as rare climaxes or punishments, not every Saturday afternoon. Lead pipes doomed Rome. Heard that one. It's more complicated. Romans used lead plumbing, but many aqueducts fed water with high carbonate content that formed protective scale inside pipes, reducing leaching. Exposure still occurred, especially via lead acetate used as a sweetener in some wines, but the lead made everyone crazy and caused the fall. Narrative oversells a single factor. Rome collapsed through a knot of problems: political fragmentation, military overreach, economics, invasions, disease. Lead wasn't the keystone. Movies dress every Roman in a toga, like it's jeans and a t-shirt. In reality, the toga was formal wear for male citizens during public life, legal proceedings, ceremonies, politics. Daily clothing was tunics and cloaks. Women didn't wear togas, they had stola and palla. The toga itself was a heavy, carefully arranged wool garment that signaled status and occasion. If you've ever struggled into a tux, you get the vibe. It's not Aaron's attire. And Nero fiddling while Rome burned? There were no fiddles. The Great Fire was in 64 CE. Bowed string instruments like the violin family are much later. Some sources say Nero performed the sack of Ilium on a stage as the city burned, which reads like propaganda. Others indicate he organized relief, opening gardens for refugees, arranging grain, pushing building codes after the fire. Nero was a controversial ruler, and hostile writers loved a dramatic smear. But here's where it gets interesting: the arena economy. Gladiator schools were private businesses or state-run with contracts, appearance fees, and medical staff. Fighters ate a high-carb barley and beans diet that built mass and endurance. Chemical analysis of bones backs this. They weren't shredded sprinters, they were durable show athletes trained to take hits and keep going. The movie image of frenzied chaos misses the choreography, the weapon matchup logic, and the referee's authority. Everything changes when you look at crowd dynamics. The amphitheater was a social pressure valve, politics, identity, and class all on display. Sponsors earned clout by delivering fair, exciting games. Killing a popular fighter despite a strong performance could backfire publicly. That's why gestures mattered less than precedent and public mood. Mercy could earn goodwill and future ticket sales. The crowd shouted yes, but the editor decided within a system that balanced spectacle and sustainability. Now bread and circuses gets quoted like all Romans were easily bribed by snacks. The phrase from Juvenal is satire, social criticism of elites buying complacency. Real Romans worked, worshipped, served, schemed, studied. Entertainment coexisted with civic life: law courts, baths, markets, collegia, military service. Reducing a 1,000-year civilization to popcorn and panem et circenses is the same flattening movies do to everything else. Let me show you another miscast detail: gladiator pairs. They weren't uniform. You had the Murmillo with a large shield and Gladius versus a Thrix with a curved Sica and smaller shield, or a Retiarius with net and trident against a Secutor with smooth helmet designed to shed that net. These pairings tested styles, not just strength. Victory looked like tactics under constraints: footwork, shield angles, stamina, not a berserk sword windmill. And those vomitoria again, think modern stadium design. Engineers borrowed Roman solutions because they worked. The Romans were obsessed with moving water, people, and goods efficiently. Aqueduct gradients over long distances, road networks with milestones, harbor logistics. They were logistics nerds. When a term gets meme-ified into a bathroom joke, you miss the real genius: civil engineering that still sets standards. Microstory, a reconstructed arena demonstration used trained performers with blunted weapons and a referee. In 3 minutes, the ref stopped the action twice for illegal strikes, the crowd booed at a premature call, and the sponsor signaled Missio mercy after a clean knockdown. The audience left talking about technique, not gore. That's closer to reality than the body count montages. So toss the thumbs up trope, retire the puke corridor, and remember the fighters as skilled pros inside a rule-bound entertainment industry. The legions built an empire, but the arenas managed a city. Medieval times weren't a mud-soaked misery montage. Let's go there next. 4. The Middle Ages, not dark, not dumb. You probably picture the Middle Ages as 1,000 years of grime, ignorance, and random stabbing. Here's what actually happened. People bathed a lot more than films admit. Urban Europe had public bathhouses, monasteries had rules for regular washing, soap-making guilds appear in records. Moralists and saints complained that some folks lingered in baths for vanity and gossip. You don't write angry sermons about bathing unless people are doing it. Most people think medieval Europeans believed in a flat earth. Educated writers from Bede to Thomas Aquinas accepted a spherical world inherited from Greek and Roman astronomy. Universities taught Ptolemaic cosmology with a round earth at the center. Mariners knew ships dipped below the horizon. The flat earth Middle Ages were invented later as a Renaissance dunk on the past and then amplified by modern pop culture. Witch burnings, the brutal European witch hunts peaked in the early modern period, 1500s to 1600s, when printing, religious conflict, and legal shifts created a storm. Medieval courts often demanded high evidence standards. Church inquisitors frequently preferred penance over pyres for superstition cases. Executions happened, yes, but they weren't a daily medieval background event. The constant bonfires of women image is a timeline error that collapses centuries to make the past look uniformly monstrous. Chivalry gets framed like a gentleman's code that tamed warfare. The real story is messier. Knights swore oaths, quoted virtues, and commissioned poems about mercy, but they still burned crops, sacked towns, and ransomed prisoners. Rules existed and were sometimes followed, especially toward peers, but brutality against civilians remained common. The code restrained some behaviors while leaving others conveniently outside the rules. Warfare was political, economic, and legal all at once, not a tournament with roses. Now the science you never see. The Middle Ages built the university as an institution. Bologna, Paris, Oxford. They systematized disputation and commentary, argued about physics, optics, and medicine. Roger Bacon wrote about experimental method. Ibn al-Haytham's work on vision flowed into Latin Europe. Scholars debated motion and impetus theory centuries before Galileo. Mechanical clocks appeared in the 1200s. Watermills and windmills spread power across landscapes. This wasn't a knowledge blackout. It was a platform built for the next revolutions. Even the Black Death story is more than leeches and prayers. Quarantine measures emerged in Italian port cities, Trentino 30 days and Quarantino 40 days, holding periods for ships, health boards policing movement, bills of health for travelers. Communities organized pest houses, modified burial practices, and tracked outbreaks with municipal records. Treatments were based on humoral theory and often ineffective, but the administrative response, cordon sanitaires, isolation, became public health foundations. That's a legacy, not a punchline. Let me show you urban life. Medieval towns weren't just muddy alleys. They had guild rules for product quality, market courts to settle disputes fast, night watches, curfew bells, weights and measures standards, and fines for dumping waste in streets. Were they spotless? No. Did people care about order? Absolutely. City councils passed sanitation ordinances because residents demanded them. Education wasn't limited to cloisters. Cathedral schools predated universities, and vernacular literacy grew with city commerce. Notaries produced contracts by the thousands. Women in certain regions ran shops, managed workshops when husbands traveled, and in some trades held guild membership. Nuns wrote theology, copied texts, and supervised hospitals. It wasn't modern equality, but it was more dynamic than the silent peasant women montage. Technology quietly scaled. The heavy plow transformed clay soils in northern Europe. The horse collar increased draft power without choking animals. Three-field rotation boosted yields. Eyeglasses show up in the late 120s, extending the working lives of scribes and artisans. Papermaking spread from the Islamic world into Europe, lowering the cost of books well before the printing press multiplied them. Progress looked like incremental fixes adding up to major shifts. Art and architecture. Cathedrals were engineering feats, flying buttresses, rib vaults, pointed arches distributing loads to push buildings higher while filling walls with stained glass. Those windows weren't just pretty, they were complex chemical recipes for color and light. Manuscript illuminators layered gold leaf and pigments sourced across continents. Trade networks moved lapis from Afghanistan, alum from Asia Minor, and dyes from the Mediterranean. A dark age doesn't coordinate that supply chain. Medicine had a framework. Humer's theory was wrong in mechanism but structured observation. pulse charts, urine wheels, regimen advice on diet and exercise. Surgeons like Guy de Chauliac documented procedures. Anesthesia by soporific sponges existed in some practices, and hospitals, especially in the Islamic world and later across Europe, provided organized care. Again, not modern but rational within available theory. Justice wasn't only trial by combat. You had manorial courts for local disputes, merchant courts for fast commercial decisions, canon law for ecclesiastical matters, and royal courts asserting central authority. Ordeals faded after the 120s as legal rationalism grew. Contracts, charters, and precedent mattered. The legal mind of the Middle Ages built the bones of later common and civil law. Microstory: a traveler walking from Chartres to Paris can find way stations, toll points, bridge repairs recorded in account books, and standardized coin exchanges under royal ordinance. That paper trail means administrators tracked revenue, enforced weights, and inspected bread loaves. Bureaucracy isn't cinematic, but it's civilization. So why does the dark and dumb myth stick? It flatters modernity and simplifies teaching. One bleak backdrop makes every later advance look like a miracle. But once you understand that medieval people bathed, studied, built, engineered, healed, and governed, imperfectly, creatively, persistently, the timeline stops being a cliff and starts being a slope. Swords weren't lightsabers either. Let's talk battlefield myths next. 5 warfare myths, from armor to arrows. Plate armor turned knights into statues, right? Here's what actually happens when you put real plate on a trained person. They run, vault, climb, and fight. Full harness weighed roughly 45–60 pounds, distributed across the body like a hiking pack. That's closer to a modern soldier's load than a walking coffin. Contemporary manuals show jumping onto horses, ground rolls, and grappling. In reenactment labs and museum tests, fighters do burpees, ladder climbs, and sprints. Heat and fatigue are real constraints, but immobility isn't the story. Smart weight distribution is. Now the longbow. Movies sell it as an instant arrow through any armor cheat code. Longbows were devastating weapons, especially in massed volleys at range against lightly armored troops, horses, and unshielded ranks. But against quality late medieval plate at battlefield distances, penetration wasn't guaranteed. Angle, range, arrow type, and impact point mattered. Broadheads shred flesh. Bodkins target gaps and mail, not magically bore through thick tempered steel. Agincourt and Crecy worked because of mud, stakes, position, discipline, and French tactical errors. Archery amplified those factors. It didn't single-handedly delete armor. But here's where it gets interesting. Armor and arrows co-evolved. As bows got stronger and arrowheads specialized, armor's thickened breastplates hardened steel and refined shapes to deflect. You can see fluting and curved surfaces that shed energy. Meanwhile, archers aimed for armpits, visors, groins, any gap created by the need to move and breathe. The fight was arrow versus plate. It was systems versus systems, weather, terrain, formation, morale, engineering. Silent movie suppressors are another favorite myth. Real suppressors reduce sound pressure and tame muzzle blast, but they don't turn gunshots into whispers, especially with supersonic rounds that still crack. Subsonic ammunition helps, sure, yet you're talking loud thump and mechanical noise, not a mouse sneeze. And they don't remove muzzle flash and recoil magic style. Tactical value is real: hearing protection, reduced signature, better follow-up shots, but the cinematic pew is fantasy. Samurai versus Knight, the internet's least useful deathmatch. Most people think you can pull 2 warriors from different centuries, climates, and doctrines and get a clean 1v1 answer. Combat effectiveness depends on context, open field or forest, armor type and era, horse access, rules of engagement. A 14th century knight in hardened plate with lance and destrier isn't the same problem as a 16th century ashigaru with teppo in a pike line. Samurai fought in combined arms with bows, spears, swords, and later firearms. Knights did 2 lances, polearms, crossbows, pavises. The real comparison is logistics, training regimens, command structure, and doctrine under their own conditions, not a YouTube arena. Bayonets causing most WWII deaths, artillery rained. Shells, shrapnel, and high explosive did the bulk of the killing. Bayonets mattered for morale, close quarters in trenches, and as multi-purpose tools, but the battlefield was dominated by indirect fire, machine guns, wire, and creeping barrages. That's why doctrine shifted towards small unit infiltration, stormtroop tactics, and combined arms with tanks and air support. Because closing to bayonet range through uncut wire under enfilade fire was suicidal. The one-punch knockout soldier trope also won't die. Adrenaline, helmets, chin straps, and body armor soak impact. In real fights, people don't fly backward, they clinch, fall awkwardly, or keep struggling. Strikes work, but so do grapples, weapons retention, and team tactics. On a battlefield, chaos, fatigue, and gear complexity make clean cinematic finishes rare. That's why training drills emphasize angles, cover, and control, not haymaker heroics. Let me show you how armor actually shaped tactics. Heavy cavalry didn't just slam blindly. Lancers coordinated with infantry pins, looked for soft spots, and exploited disorder. Infantry carried billhooks, poleaxes, halberds, tools designed to manipulate an armored opponent. Hook and pull, trip, strike joints, then finish with a rondelle dagger at a gap. Manuals devote pages to half-sorting, gripping the blade to thrust precisely into openings. You don't write that down unless it works. Everything changes when you factor terrain. Mud negates horses, rain slackens bowstrings, wind skews volleys. Stakes and ditches force cavalry to break formation. Pavises give crossbowmen mobile cover to reload safely. Gunpowder adds smoke, flash, and morale shock well before it can pierce top-tier plate consistently. The side that bent the environment, ditches, wagons, palisades, often decided the fight before the first clash. Micro story, a test team put an experienced archer against a replica harness at 25 meters with mixed arrows. Some glanced, some stuck shallow at oblique angles, one drove into a visor slit only when the target was fixed and square. Then they added a moving shield and a rushing line, hit rates plummeted. That's the point, armor buys survivability so you can advance, not invulnerability so you can pose. And about cost, plate wasn't universal. Many soldiers wore jacks, brigandine, mail, or just a helmet. Commanders mixed units to cover weaknesses, pikes to stop horses, missile troops to pressure lines, armored men at arms to break through. Logistics, fodder for horses, spare strings, powder supply often mattered more than any single weapon. If you can't feed cavalry, your shock arm evaporates. Finally, the movie trope of swords slicing armor like butter needs to retire. Edges chip on hardened steel. That's why you see percussive cuts to limbs without plate, thrusts to gaps, and maces and hammers flourishing when plate quality rises. Weapon diversity is a clue. If a longsword did everything, nobody invests in poleaxes, estocks, warhammers, and crossbows. Each tool solves a specific problem. So no statues in plate, no magic arrows, no whisper guns, and no fantasy cage matches across centuries. Real warfare is systems thinking, gear, training, terrain, morale, and logistics working together. Now the explorers, no, they didn't discover occupied lands. 6. Exploration and colonization clean the record. Columbus didn't prove the Earth is round. Sailors already used the curve of the horizon, celestial navigation, and latitude sailing. The real debate in 1492 wasn't shape, it was size. Columbus lowballed Earth's circumference and got lucky that the Caribbean was in the way. Most learned Europeans followed larger estimates from Eratosthenes and others. He gambled on a smaller ocean and ran into islands before starvation settled the argument. You've heard Vikings discovered America like it's a bar joke. The evidence is hard. At Elance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, Norse-style buildings, ironworking slag, and artifact typology date to around 100 CE. That's centuries before Columbus. They weren't mythic drifters, they planned westward stages. Iceland, Greenland, then short-lived North American outposts shaped by resources, distance, and politics back home. Their footprint was real but brief. Thanksgiving as a pilgrim invention is a neat school play, not the full story. Early harvest feasts existed in Europe and among indigenous peoples long before 1621. What happened in Plymouth was a diplomatic moment in a landscape transformed by epidemic disease that had already devastated regional populations. Wampanoag pilgrim relations hinged on survival, alliance, and leverage, not a spontaneous kumbaya dinner repeated annually. Later, New Englanders retrofitted the story to serve identity building. Maps weren't blank canvases with here be dragons smeared across oceans. Medieval and early modern charts showed detailed coastlines, ports, prevailing winds, and pilot instructions. The Portuguese roteiros and portolan charts were professional tools carved out by centuries of trade in the Mediterranean and along Africa's coast. Even unknown zones were bounded by rumor-turned data as ships pushed soundings further. Navigation was incremental, not single-hero revelation. Conquistadors weren't a handful of lucky men toppling empires by grit. Yes, the numbers were tiny compared to Mesoamerican and Andean populations, but they arrived inside complex political systems. Cortés made alliances with indigenous groups hostile to the Aztec Triple Alliance. Smallpox and other diseases ripped through communities with no prior exposure. Horses, steel, and gunpowder introduced shock more than unstoppable firepower. Local geography, civil wars, and captured interpreters like Melanson shaped outcomes as much as European arms. Manifest destiny being inevitable is a retroactive myth. Continental expansion was contingent on election cycles, fragile treaties, rival empires, native resistance, and economics. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't foreordained, it hinged on Napoleonic strategy. Texas, Oregon, and California were negotiated, fought for, or opportunistically seized when geopolitical windows opened. Indigenous diplomacy and resistance constantly bent the path, even when overwhelmed. Let me show you the maritime backbone. Caravels and naus weren't magic ships, they were designed compromises. Lateen sails for windward ability, square sails for speed, stronger hulls for Atlantic swells. Dead reckoning plus sounding lines and later better charts made risky trips manageable. The hero at the wheel is fun, but the real win was crews that could splice a line in a storm and quartermasters who rationed water without mutiny. Another quiet correction. Discovery language erases pre-existing trade networks. The Caribbean and the Americas had layered routes for obsidian, shell, copper, foodstuffs, and ideas. The Columbian exchange was explosive not because a void got filled, but because two dense ecosystems, biological and cultural, smashed together. Potatoes, maize, cassava, and tomatoes transformed old-world diets. Horses, cattle, and wheat remade landscapes in the new. Diseases flowed lopsidedly, with catastrophic effect in the Americas. Movies also smoothed colonial rule into a single villain's will. Empires were messy. Crown policy, private enterprise, missionary orders, and local cabildos pulled in different directions. Encomienda, repartimiento, and later hacienda systems evolved under legal fights in Madrid and on the ground. The Black Legend and its counter-legend both oversimplify a spectrum of exploitation, reform attempts, and self-interest. If a film skips the paperwork, it misses the machine. Micro-story: a navigational dead reckoning log shows a captain correcting course after a current set him west overnight. He adjusts sail plan, notes cloud types, and records sea state. That's the daily grind that gets a ship to a coast alive, tiny decisions multiplied, not a dramatic compass slam. Cartography had its own politics. Mercator's projection helped with straight-line courses but distorted polar areas. National cartographers guarded coastal data as state secrets. You'll find deliberate falsifications, phantom islands used as intellectual property traps. Maps are arguments as much as measurements, and colonizers weaponized both. Colonial encounters weren't one-note violence or one-way influence. Hybrid languages, syncretic religions, legal petitions by indigenous leaders, maroon communities, and commercial partnerships show constant negotiation. Resistance ranged from open war to day-to-day foot-dragging and legal maneuvering. Spanish courts heard indigenous lawsuits citing royal protections, some were won. Complexity doesn't absolve harm, it reveals agency where movies show none. And about empty land, doctrines like terra nullius classified places as unused if they didn't match European agriculture, ignoring sophisticated land management, controlled burns, terracing, irrigation, agroforestry. Landscapes Europeans thought natural were often engineered by centuries of human care. Everything changes when you see exploration as risk-managed logistics and colonization as layered power, not a montage of flags on beaches. It wasn't genius men conjuring continents. It was crews, maps, microbes, allies, rivals, accidents, and paperwork colliding. Founding fathers next, less marble, more messy. Founders and revolutions, nuance beats myth. George Washington's teeth weren't wooden. Dentists of his day built partial dentures from ivory, hippo, and elephant, anchored with metal springs, and yes, human teeth purchased from the poor and enslaved. They stained, cracked, and smelled, which probably birthed the wood myth. The point isn't gross trivia, it's a window into early dentistry, social inequality, and why Washington's portraits show a tight, pained mouth. He led a revolution while fighting chronic dental misery. Most people think the Declaration of Independence landed like a perfect national high five. In 1776, the colonies were split. Loyalists stayed with Britain for reasons ranging from principle to profit. Many fled or were harassed. Enslaved people heard all men are created equal and were not freed. Women had no political rights. What changed was the argument about sovereignty, who had the right to legislate for colonists, and the invention of a public claim to universal rights that activists would throw back at the founders for generations. Let's jump to Paris. The Bastille wasn't a sprawling gulag packed with political prisoners. On July 14, 1789, there were 7 inmates, 4 forgers, 2 madmen, and a noble accused of vice. But it wasn't empty symbolism. The fortress embodied arbitrary royal power. Letters de cachet could lock you up without trial. Storming it was a strike at a system, not a jailbreak for heroes. The act mattered more than the headcount. The French Revolution wasn't just guillotine montages. It overhauled law, abolished feudal dues, opened careers to talent, secularized the state, and created a national army through mass conscription. It standardized weights and measures with the metric system, built new schools, and rationalized taxation. Violence scarred it, terror, civil war in the Vendée, but reforms outlived the bloodshed and spread across Europe through conquest and imitation. Movies love the basket, they skip the code. Back to the American Revolution. No taxation without representation was catchy, but the fight was larger: constitutional order, imperial reform, westward settlement, and who controlled trade. Britain tried to tighten administration after expensive global wars. Colonists defended their assemblies and customary liberties. When Parliament claimed sweeping authority, radicals reframed the dispute from policy to principle. That shift from negotiating subjects to self-governing citizens drove the break more than any single tax. Paul Revere didn't ride alone through cinematic darkness screaming, "The British are coming." First, writers didn't say British. Everyone in Massachusetts considered themselves British. They warned that regulars or redcoats were out. Second, it was a network: William Dawes, Samuel Prescott, local militias, church bells, and prearranged signals. Revere was detained, others carried the alarm further. The real story is a community information system, not a lone hero on a perfect horse. Now the founders in slavery sanitized on screen contested in life. Some, like Hamilton, opposed aspects of the system yet worked within slaveholding economies. Others, like Jefferson, wrote liberty and owned hundreds of people. Gradual abolition began in northern states during and after the war. The Constitution embedded compromises that would explode later. Treating the era as pure idealism erases the struggle abolitionists, free black communities, and enslaved resistors waged immediately. Over in France, the guillotine gets cast as sadism. It was sold as a humane reform, quick, equal application, replacing slower, class-coded executions. It symbolizes terror because it industrialized killing and made the state's power visible. But the same decade saw experiments in public education, civic festivals, and the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen. Contradiction sits at the center, lofty rights next to emergency repression. Micro-story. In 1793, a Paris section petitions for bread price controls, while a priest-turned-legislator argues for religious freedom in the same assembly. That's the revolution, a crowd managing hunger and a chamber defining rights under pressure from war, debt, and every old institution collapsing at once. Let's untangle myths about crowds, too. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a drunken free-for-all. Participants disguised themselves, targeted East India Company tea, avoided looting private property, and cleaned up afterward to frame the act as political, not criminal. The mob managed optics. Likewise, French crowds carried petitions, wrote cahiers, and debated in clubs. They weren't permanent riots in wigs. Another sticky half-truth is that independence in America instantly created democracy. Voting remained restricted by property and gender. Many states kept established churches for a time. Indigenous nations weren't citizens and faced dispossession masked as treaty-making. Yet the period birthed a culture of pamphlets, associations, and lawsuits that cracked doors open. Gradual isn't cinematic, but it's how institutions shift. Here's what actually happens when you strip the marble sheen. Revolutions are paperwork and provisioning. Committees audit saltpeter for gunpowder. Quartermasters chase wagons. Printers burn through type to churn out broadsides. In France, assignats, paper money backed by confiscated church lands, swing from solution to inflationary mess. In America, continental currency depreciates and soldiers go unpaid. Finance drives strategy. Ideals don't march without shoes. Why do the myths stick? Simple narratives sell. Wooden teeth, lone riders, evil fortresses, endless guillotines, clean images beat complex processes, but nuance doesn't kill the drama, it raises the stakes. People built new political worlds while wrestling with hypocrisy, hunger, and war. That tension is the real story. Genius time next, Einstein didn't flunk math and Newton saw more than an apple. Science legends, smarter than the movie version. Einstein didn't fail math. When he was 12, he taught himself algebra and Euclid. By 16, he was solving advanced problems and acing standardized math components. The famous Einstein failed math line comes from a grading scale confusion and a broader myth that genius equals chaotic underachievement. What he actually rejected was rigid authoritarian schooling, not mathematics. The real lesson is persistence. He worked as a patent clerk while refining relativity, reading papers at lunch, and building ideas methodically. Newton's apple wasn't a cinematic thunderbolt. He told friends later that an apple's fall got him thinking about why the moon doesn't fall, same force, different circumstances. That scrap didn't become universal gravitation overnight. It took decades of calculus, data from astronomers like Halley and Flamsteed, and endless drafts. Movies love a eureka moment. Science usually looks like long patience meeting good records. Tesla versus Edison is not a superhero rivalry with two neat sides. The war of currents involved dozens of engineers, financiers, and city contracts. Tesla contributed major AC innovations, polyphase motors and transformers, while Westinghouse provided capital and manufacturing. Edison's DC had strengths in localized systems, but AC won long-distance transmission because transformers step voltage up and down efficiently. Also, Tesla wasn't a solitary prophet. He filed patents, ran labs, and collaborated widely before his later struggles. You only use 10% of your brain sounds profound and demolishes nuance in one line. Brain imaging shows widespread activity even during rest. Different networks light up for memory, movement, vision, and default mode daydreaming. Could you unlock more? Only by training skills, not by waking a dormant lobe. The myth survives because it sells shortcuts. Reality says practice, sleep, and feedback build neural efficiency. Cavemen didn't grunt their way through chaos. Stone tools required recipe-like steps, select raw material, set angle, control percussion. Some Upper Paleolithic sites show planned hunts, long-distance trade in obsidian and shells, and remarkable art with consistent conventions across regions. Language capacity likely predated such cultural complexity. When you see hand stencils in caves and beads carved from bone, you're watching symbolic thinking, not random noise. Galileo versus the Church gets framed as lone scientist against monolithic faith. The truth is complicated. Clergy included skilled astronomers. Jesuit mathematicians initially praised Galileo's telescopic findings. Conflict rose over biblical interpretation, academic politics, personality, and the claim to define natural philosophy. Galileo's dialogue mocked a powerful ally and pushed a model the church hadn't fully digested. He faced censure, yes, yet lived under house arrest, wrote, and remained a believing Catholic. The fight was over authority and method as much as heliocentrism. Here's what actually happens in real discovery. You build on networks. Einstein used Lorenz's transformations and Poincaré's insights. Newton leaned on Kepler and Galileo. Tesla stood on Faraday and Maxwell. Movies erase the scaffolding to spotlight a single face. But science is cumulative and social. Lab techs, instrument makers, statisticians, and peer reviewers form the invisible cast. Microstory: a grad student repeats a classic experiment and gets weird noise. Instead of tossing it, she checks the baseline, recalibrates sensors, and finds a setup flaw in the cited paper. She publishes a correction that changes a small constant hundreds of labs rely on. No fireworks, just better numbers and a field shift slightly. That's impact. Let's puncture another trope: the genius as chaotic slob. Precision dominates actual work. Lab notebooks timestamp procedures, parameters, and deviations. Version control tracks code. Pre-registrations nail down hypotheses. The myth of inspired mess masks the grind that prevents self-deception. When breakthroughs happen, they often look obvious in hindsight because the groundwork made them inevitable. Now, creativity isn't a myth. It's just married to discipline. Kekulé's dream of the benzene ring follows years of chemical puzzles. Ramanujan's stunning formulas were born from relentless practice and intuitive leaps shaped by number theory traditions. Even accidents like penicillin came from a researcher trained well enough to recognize significance instead of cleaning a dish and forgetting it. Pop culture also skews lab safety and ethics. Mad scientist montages ignore animal care protocols, IRBs, radiation badges, and a mountain of compliance. Bureaucracy can be frustrating, but it exists because history taught hard lessons. Tuskegee, thalidomide, radium jaw. Real progress balances curiosity with safeguards. Another correction: models aren't guesses. A climate model, for example, encodes physics, radiation balance, fluid dynamics, chemistry, then gets tested against historical data. When it predicts patterns that match observations, confidence grows. Imperfect, always, useless, not when decisions ride on trends, not individual storms. Science updates confidence, not dogma. And about breakthroughs every week: true and false. Preprint servers pour out findings, but replication filters them. The papers that last either explain more with fewer assumptions or solve problems others couldn't crack. Fame distorts this, highlighting splashy claims while quiet revolutions, like CRISPR guide design algorithms or better catalysts, change entire industries without a single dramatic speech. One more myth: lone genius hoards knowledge. Modern science runs on sharing open data, code repositories, conference posters. Patents protect some inventions, but even their disclosures are the point. The incentive structure rewards being first and being right, and both require others to see, test, and use your work. So strip away the movie cliches. Einstein studied hard, Newton calculated for decades, Tesla engineered with teams, brains run full tilt, cavemen crafted and planned, and Galileo fought a system, not just a villain. Now to medicine: doctors weren't butchers all the time. Medicine and health beyond leeches and blood. Most people think pre-modern doctors just waved leeches and hoped for miracles. Here's what actually happened. Medieval and early modern medicine worked within humoral theory, a wrong model, yes, but it created a structured approach to observation, prognosis, and regimen. Physicians tracked pulse, urine color, diet, sleep, and seasons. Surgeons distinguished wounds by mechanism: cut, stab, crush, and wrote manuals on ligatures, cautery, and wound cleaning. Rational within their framework, not random bloodletting every time. Anesthesia existed well before Civil War scenes with men biting bullets. Ether anesthesia was publicly demonstrated in 1846 at Massachusetts General Hospital, and chloroform spread rapidly after 1847. By the 1850s, obstetricians and surgeons used inhaled agents widely in Europe and the Americas. Earlier still, some traditions used soporific sponges, opium, henbane, mandrake, though effects were inconsistent. The movie trope of surgery done fully awake as a universal norm ignores a fast 19th century adoption curve that transformed pain management. Let's fix the defibrillator myth. Shocking a flatline doesn't restart a stopped heart. Defibrillators treat specific lethal arrhythmias, ventricular fibrillation, and pulseless ventricular tachycardia by delivering energy to reset chaotic electrical activity so the heart's natural pacemaker can resume. Asystole is managed with high-quality CPR, epinephrine, and treatment of causes, not dramatic paddles and a shouted clear. Accuracy matters because real bystanders mimic what they've seen, and bad portrayals cost time. Vaccines aren't a modern surprise either. Before Jenner popularized cowpox vaccination in 1796, variolation, deliberate exposure to smallpox material, existed in parts of Asia and Africa and was introduced into Europe and colonial America in the early 170s. It carried risks but cut mortality drastically compared to natural infection. Jenner's method reduced danger further. The arc from variolation to vaccination shows global knowledge moving through correspondence, travelers, and community debates. Families weighed risk trade-offs, not blind obedience. Antibiotics are miracle tools, not universal fix-alls. They kill or inhibit bacteria, not viruses. That means colds and flu don't improve on amoxicillin. Overuse breeds resistance. Penicillin saved lives in WWII, but by the 1950s, bacteria were evolving defenses. Stewardship policies narrow spectrum when possible, correct duration aren't bureaucratic fussiness, they keep drugs working. Movies make antibiotics instant plot devices. Real medicine uses them with targeted intent. Plague doctors in beaked masks weren't theatrical villains. The beak held aromatic herbs thought to purify miasmas, the era's best guess at airborne corruption. While not proven effective, the design aimed at filtration and distancing, long robes, gloves, and canes to examine patients without touch. It's a primitive PPE concept, surprisingly modern in intent if not in mechanism. Again, wrong model, rational response. Now hospital reality. Monastic infirmaries and later civic hospitals weren't just hospice wards. They fed patients, provided bed rest, tracked diets, and managed sanitation as resources allowed. In the Islamic world, Bimaristans ran wards by disease category, paid staff, and kept formularies. By the early modern period, anatomical theaters and teaching hospitals connected bedside practice with dissection, improving surgical mapping. You get a pipeline from Galenic commentary to Vesalius's corrections to Harvey's circulation work, a steady hardening of the evidence base. Microstory: a barber surgeon in 1544 ties off a bleeding artery with a ligature instead of cauterizing with a red-hot iron, following Ambroise Paré's advice after he ran out of boiling oil in battle and noticed better outcomes. That pivot from tradition to observation spreads because patients live, not because a guild master declares it by fiat. Results rewrite rules. Public health wasn't an invention of 20th century boards. Quarantines, lazarettos, and sanitary cordons emerged in port cities facing recurring epidemics. Bills of mortality tracked causes of death. Night soil collection and water supply rules crept into municipal law. Clean water and waste management improved survival before anyone knew about microbes. When germ theory landed, it meshed with habits that already leaned toward separation, filtration, and boiling. Speaking of germ theory, it didn't arrive as a single thunderclap. Microscopy hinted at animalcules, puerperal fever data pointed to handwashing long before acceptance, and lab methods standardized proof. Semmelweis fought for chlorinated handwashing, Pasteur explained fermentation and microbes, Lister applied carbolic acid to surgery, cutting infection dramatically. Adoption took time because habits, pride, and workflow resist change, not because people loved filth. Mental health myths run deep too. Asylums varied wildly, some were warehouses, others attempted moral treatment with structure, work, and talk. Late 19th and early 20th century biological theories led to harsh interventions, yet they also pushed toward medicalizing conditions instead of criminalizing or demonizing them. The modern shift to community care and evidence-based therapy stands on painful lessons, not a straight line of cruelty. Herbal medicine wasn't random hedgerow grabbing. Apothecaries kept recipes, weighed ingredients, and sourced materia medica across trade routes. Willow bark for pain, foxglove precursors for cardiac issues, cinchona bark for fevers. Potency varied, adulteration existed, and mechanisms were unknown, but empirical. This seems to help sometimes map to later pharmacology. The danger wasn't plants per se, it was dosage, purity, and misapplied theory. Everything changes when you respect constraints. Limited tools force triage, diet and regimen first, surgery as last resort, contagion managed with distance. As tools improve, anesthesia, antisepsis, imaging practice reorders. Movies flatten this into butchers and miracle workers. Real clinicians moved stepwise, testing, recording, and arguing. One last correction: resuscitation isn't just chest pounding. High-quality compressions at correct depth and rate, minimal interruptions, early defibrillation for shockable rhythms, airway management, and post-ROSC care drive survival. Teach that, show that, and people live. Next up, crime and punishment. No, torture wasn't the default. 10 Crime, Punishment, and Pirates. Torture looks like the default in films because it's visual. But here's what actually happened in many legal systems. Torture, where allowed, was tightly regulated, often as a last resort to confirm an already strong case, and usually prohibited against certain classes like nobles or clergy without special authorization. Roman canon procedure demanded corroborating evidence. Early modern continental courts required a half-proof before any ordeal in the chamber. In England, common law generally banned judicial torture. The infamous rack was used by royal prerogative in state cases, not routine burglary trials. And confessions extracted under pain were often invalid unless repeated later, calm and uncoerced. Was abuse real? Absolutely. Was it the everyday first stop tool? No, paperwork, witnesses, oaths, and reputation weighed heavily. Pirates almost never buried treasure. Why would a crew of short-lived gamblers lock wealth in a beach they might never see again? Loot was mostly perishable or quickly liquidated. Textiles, food, gunpowder, rum, sugar, indigo, cocoa, porcelain, coin. Crews split shares by articles agreed beforehand, captain and quartermaster larger portions, specialists like surgeons and carpenters bonuses, injury compensation spelled out down to the finger or eye. That's the opposite of chaos. That's a floating labor contract. When they did stash goods, it was short-term caching to dodge a patrol or unload weight, not a grand map with an X. Walking the plank shows up on screen because it's theatrical. Period records show far more mundane punishments: marooning with minimal supplies, keel-hauling in naval contexts, whipping or simply killing prisoners outright. Sometimes captives were traded, ransomed, or impressed into service. Planking appears rarely in late accounts, often second-hand. Pirates used fear as a weapon, but time was money. Why stage a ritual when you could be miles away by morning? The Jolly Roger wasn't a single skull and crossbones brand all pirates swore to. Flags varied by crew and captain, hourglasses to warn that time was running out, skeletons with spears, bleeding hearts, black for negotiation and red for no quarter. The logic was psychological warfare. Fly colors, show you're serious, convince a target to surrender without a fight, and you keep hull, cargo, and sailors intact. Repairs are expensive. Cannon smoke makes drama, not profit. Dueling culture gets flattened into hotheads firing at dawn. In reality, honor cultures across Europe and the Americas codified duels to limit blood feuds. Seconds negotiated terms, matched weapons, checked fairness, and tried to broker apologies to avoid shots at all. Many affairs ended after first blood or a deliberate miss to satisfy pride. Courts often frowned on or outlawed duels, so participants staged plausible deniability. The point wasn't body count, it was reputation management inside a peer group. Outlaws like Robin Hood weren't single historical men with a perfect arc. Robin Hood reads like a composite: ballads, plays, and local politics layered over centuries. Early versions paint him as a yeoman clashing with corrupt officials. Later stories tack on aristocratic origins and charity tropes. Folklore tends to accrete whatever lesson the age wants: social justice, nationalist flair, or gentle rebellion. Treating him like a lone rogue in green misses the function of outlaw tales as critique. Now, pirate democracy, the part movies sometimes hint at but don't explain. Crews often elected captains and quartermasters. Captains commanded in battle and storms. Quartermasters represented the crew in daily affairs, kept discipline, assigned quarters, even rationed food. Shares and rules were written in articles everyone swore to. Why? Because merchant and naval ships were authoritarian and exploitative. Pirate governance incentivized risk and protected the rank and file from arbitrary cruelty. It wasn't egalitarian utopia, but it was rational for a high-risk startup at sea. Micro-story: a captured merchant captain once testified that the pirates offered his crew a choice: join and take standard shares or stay and be set ashore unharmed. Half joined, half refused. The pirates logged the decision and moved on. That kind of paperwork for survival moment shows how incentives beat terror in building crews who will actually fight when needed. Courtrooms weren't endless gavel smashes either. On the continent, inquisitorial judges gathered dossiers over time. In England, fast jury trials ran on live witness testimony, with reputation and character evidence weighing heavily. Plea bargaining existed in various forms: approvers turning state's evidence, crown witnesses getting leniency. Public executions served as civic theater meant to deter and reaffirm order, not just gore reels. Everyone from sheriffs to beadles to scribes had roles that made the system grind along. And about thief-takers and bounty hunters, they were real, especially in 18th century London, where private rewards encouraged informants. That created perverse incentives, fabricated accusations, entrapment, so reforms followed: salaried police, investigative standards, prosecutorial discretion. Crime control evolved through messy trial and error, not a single leap from chaos to modern policing. Corsairs blur the pirate line further. State-licensed privateers sailed with letters of marque to raid enemy commerce legally during wartime. Some crossed into piracy when peace arrived or when they exceeded commissions. The difference was paperwork and whose court judged you. To a captured merchant, both looked like armed robbery, but in law, one brought prize cases before admiralty courts, the other danced at the gallows. Let's fix another trope: drunken free-for-alls. Alcohol was present, sure, but discipline mattered. Ships needed sober hands for night watches, reefing sails, sounding shoals. Articles often limited drinking to specific times or shares. The quartermaster could confiscate hoarded liquor to prevent chaos before a hazardous passage. Survival demanded order. Everything changes when you see motive. Torture's cinematic ubiquity sells fear. Real courts preferred confessions that would hold. Pirates cultivated terror to avoid battle. Real profit came from surrender, not slaughter. Duels constrained violence under a code. They weren't random shootouts. Folklore compressed many lives into one mask to argue a point about justice. One more quick correction: treasure maps with cryptic verses. Maritime people did keep logs and charts, but the poetic riddles belonged to novelists. If a crew hid goods, the map might be a landmark note shared orally among a few. Secrecy protects assets, puzzles entertain readers. So strip away the spectacle. Crime and punishment ran on incentives and paperwork. Pirates ran on contracts and psychology. Outlaw legends ran on critique. Let's clear up WWII cliches because Hollywood loves them. 11 World Wars myths that won't die. France gave up in 1940, right? Look at the numbers. In 1914-1918, France lost around 1.3 million soldiers and fought 4 years on home soil. By 194, they faced a rearmed Germany, political fractures, and a blitz that punched through the Ardennes where planners thought armor couldn't mass. The French army fought hard at places like Gembloux and Ston. A strategic collapse isn't the same as cowardice. Dunkirk wasn't victory, it was evacuation under fire, made possible in part by French rearguard actions. Simplifying it to France folded erases context and sacrifice. Another big one: the United States won WWII alone. The Soviet-German front devoured the bulk of the Wehrmacht. Stalingrad, Kursk, Operation Bagration. Those battles chewed through divisions at a scale unmatched in the West. Meanwhile, American and British industry, shipping and air power mattered enormously. Lend-lease trucks, food, locomotives, and aircraft kept the Red Army moving. The Western Allies' bombing campaigns and the Mediterranean and Normandy invasions split German attention. Victory was coalition logistics and multi-front pressure, not a solo act. Enigma wasn't cracked by a single eccentric genius in a tweed coat. Polish cryptanalysts, including Marian Rejewski, built foundational methods before the war and shared them with Britain and France in 1939. At Bletchley Park, teams of mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and Wrens ran bombs, built traffic analysis, and scaled procedures. Alan Turing was pivotal, yes, but success depended on industrialized code breaking, captured key material, and relentless shift work. Intelligence wins look like teamwork and process. Kamikaze pilots weren't mindless drones. They emerged from strategic desperation late in the Pacific War, when Japan faced material collapse and aircrew quality had plummeted. Pilots wrote letters, trained for specific attack profiles, and sometimes missed, were shot down or diverted. The tactic inflicted real damage, ships were sunk and crews killed, but it didn't reverse the strategic tide against radar-directed defenses, combat air patrols, and overwhelming Allied production. Hiroshima and Nagasaki alone forced surrender. End of story. The timeline complicates that. The bombs on August 6 and 9 delivered unprecedented shock. But on August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, crushing the Kwantung Army and destroying hopes for a mediated peace via Moscow. Japanese cabinet minutes show intense debate. The combination of nuclear devastation and Soviet entry shattered both military capacity and diplomatic options. Multiple pressures converged. The clean Wehrmacht myth lingers in movies that separate the army from Nazi crimes. Documents, orders, and field actions show otherwise. The army participated in mass shootings, starvation policies, and reprisals, especially in the East. Commissar orders, anti-partisan bandit operations, and logistical support for SS units tie the institution to systemic violence. Post-war narratives polished reputations for Cold War reasons. Archives don't support the polish. France in WWII again deserves a clearer lens. Verdun and the Somme weren't noble charges for nothing. They were attritional grinders where artillery ruled. By 1917, French mutinies weren't blanket refusal to fight. They were protests against suicidal offensives while units still held lines. Nivelle's failed plan gave way to Pétain's stabilization, rest, better rations, limited objective attacks, more artillery coordination. The army recovered and fought effectively in 1918. Myth-check: D-Day was won on the beaches by sheer courage alone. Courage mattered, but the setup was monstrous. Deception operations, fortitude with fake armies, whether calls that gambled on a break, naval gunfire, airborne drops to seize causeways, Pluto fuel pipelines, Mulberry harbors, and months of grinding hedgerow fighting after June 6. The breakout at St. Lo and Operation Cobra finally opened France. Logistics and adaptability carried the day after the beachhead. Submarines won by Hollywood cat and mouse with perfect pings. The real battle of the Atlantic turned on technology curves. Huff-duff for bearings, radar and lee lights for night air attacks, convoy discipline, improved depth charges, hedgehog mortars, breaking naval Enigma, and finally escort carriers that filled the mid-Atlantic gap. Wolfpacks suffered when detection and air cover closed the window they exploited. It's not luck, it's iteration. Gas dominated WWII. It terrified, but artillery killed more. Gas-forced masks, drills, and tactics changes, weather limited its use, countermeasures blunted effects. The big killers were shells, machine gun belts, and disease. That's why procurement obsessed over shells per day rates and railheads, not gas stockpiles alone. Micro story, a Liberty ship convoy loses a freighter to a U-boat. The escort logs bearings, drops patterns, and radios a support group. A very long-range Liberator catches a snorkel on radar 12 hours later and forces a crash dive. The U-boat escapes but loses the initiative. Multiply that by hundreds and the curve bends. Another sticky trope, every German tank was a Tiger, most weren't. Panzer IVs and later Panthers were more common. Tigers were rare, maintenance-heavy, and fuel-hungry. Allied doctrine focused on combined arms, artillery engineers, air power over tank dueling. Sherman tanks were reliable, numerous, easy to fix, and deadly when paired with tank destroyers, bazookas, and jabos overhead. Quantity plus uptime plus integration beats a handful of apex predators. Strategic bombing won the war by itself is also off. Bombing degraded oil, rail, and aircraft production, forced resource diversion, and hammered morale, but ground forces still had to take cities. The combined bomber offensive paid off most when it strangled fuel before the 1944-45 offensives. Again, systems, not soloists. Why do these myths persist? Clean images travel, lone codebreaker, single bomb, one heroic nation, one villain army. The truth is coalition warfare, industry, math, weather, politics, and horrific attrition. Cold War narratives and national pride sanded edges. But once you see the machine, convoys, code rooms, factories, staffs, the victories look even larger because they were built, not wished. Cold War next, spies, nukes, and narratives. 12 Cold War and modern myths. Duck and cover was useless, right? Here's what actually happens in a nuclear blast. Distance and shielding dominate survival. For people miles from ground zero, dropping behind sturdy objects, covering exposed skin, and protecting eyes can prevent flash burns, retinal damage, and lacerations from flying glass. The pressure wave hits seconds after the flash. Being low and away from windows matters. It won't save you at the epicenter, but at realistic urban distances, it reduces injuries and keeps you mobile for evacuation. Not heroics, basic risk reduction. Most people think the space race was a Hollywood soundstage. The receipts are everywhere. Independent radio amateurs tracked transmissions, foreign observatories followed trajectories, and reflector arrays left on the moon still bounce lasers back today. Apollo missions generated piles of telemetry, rock samples with solar wind exposure histories, and photos that match known star positions and lighting physics. Faking that would have required a conspiracy spanning thousands of engineers across rival companies, universities, and nations. The simpler story wins. Rockets flew, people walked, data came home. The Berlin Wall didn't fall because one man gave a single magical speech. The collapse was a pressure cooker. Economic stagnation, mass immigration via Hungary and Czechoslovakia, protests in Leipzig, and reformers inside the East German state. Then a bungled press conference on new travel rules led border guards, confused, underprepared, and facing swelling crowds, to open checkpoints on November 9, 1989. A bureaucratic misread met public momentum, and concrete lost to people with hammers. Inspiring speeches mattered, but the hinge was administrative chaos plus civic bravery. Vietnam wasn't lost because politicians tied soldiers' hands. The war pitted a powerful conventional military against a hybrid adversary, insurgency plus a state-backed army, with sanctuaries across borders, deep local networks, and time on their side. US and ARVN forces won many tactical fights, but struggled to translate them into durable political control. Public opinion at home, corruption in Saigon, North Vietnamese resilience, and strategic missteps on both sides produced the outcome. It wasn't a pristine battlefield plan smothered by suits. It was a complex mismatch of aims, incentives, and legitimacy. The CIA as omnipotent puppet master. The historical record reads like mixed batting averages. Yes, coups in Iran 1953 and Guatemala 1954 tipped governments, but there were also faceplants, the Bay of Pigs, misreads of Soviet intentions, blown covers, and failed assassination plots. Covert action stretches influence at the margins. It doesn't conjure stable realities from thin air. Logistics, local politics, and long-term legitimacy still decide the endgame. Spies are force multipliers, not magic wands. Nuclear weapons don't leave fireballs forever. The physics is harsh but nuanced. Prompt effects, blast, heat, radiation happen fast. Fallout depends on yield, height of burst, and weather. Ground bursts kick up radioactive debris that decays on predictable curves. Minutes to hours for the nastiest gamma spikes, days to weeks for significant hazards, and longer tails for specific isotopes. Survivability exists with sheltering, time, and decontamination. That's why civil defense taught stay put for 24-48 hours in many scenarios. Let the short-lived isotopes burn down before moving. Here's where it gets interesting. Deterrence wasn't just both sides pressed buttons. It was command and control engineering, early warning radars, submarine basing to ensure second strike capability, hotlines to reduce misinterpretation, and endless war games. Crises like 1962 hinged on leaders interpreting noisy data streams while keeping hawks and hardliners in check. Failures and near misses happened, false alarms triggered by clouds, training tapes, or a moonrise, but layers of verification and human judgment usually caught them. The system creaked more than movies admit, yet redundancy saved lives. Everything changes when you factor in domestic economies. The Cold War was also a manufacturing marathon: microchips, aerospace composites, container shipping, and software pipelines. Space hardware, advanced materials science, defense contracts seeded the internet's architecture, satellite networks normalized global weather forecasting and GPS. Not every dollar was efficient, but the spillovers built modern infrastructure. Arms race sounds wasteful. In practice, R&D fed civilian tech while politicians sold it as security. Pop culture loves the lone super spy. The reality is analysts parsing signal intercepts, diplomats gaming treaty language, and case officers cultivating sources for months without Hollywood chase scenes. Intelligence wins look like a better model that predicts a missile test window, a logistics memo that reveals fuel bottlenecks, a cultural note that explains why a speech landed badly. Boring? Maybe. Decisive? Often. Success is fewer surprises, not a perfect prediction every time. Micro story: a NORAD crew gets a launch alert in the middle of the night. Protocol says cross-check independent sensors. One screen blares attack, another stays calm. A supervisor calls for additional verification instead of escalating immediately. Minutes pass. The alert turns out to be a training tape left in a system. The hero isn't a maverick, it's a checklist and a team that trusts it. Let's clean up stealth myths. Invisible planes aren't literally invisible. Stealth reduces radar cross-section at certain angles and frequencies. Pair that with careful routing, electronic warfare, and timing, and you get survivability, not invulnerability. Adversaries adapt with low-frequency radars, multistatic arrays, and infrared systems. It's a cat and mouse of physics and tactics, not a cloak of invisibility. And about mutually assured destruction made war impossible, not quite. It made direct superpower war less likely, while proxy conflicts burned hot in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and across Africa and Latin America. MAD narrowed choices at the top and pushed competition into economics, culture, and covert action. Stability at one layer, instability beneath it. Why do these myths persist? They're clean: useless drills, moon hoaxes, magic speeches, scapegoat politicians, all-powerful spies, eternal fireballs. The truth is systems: layered defenses, verifiable science, messy bureaucracies, human judgment, and half-lives on a clock. Now the big screen science that quietly rewires your brain. 13. Science in movies: fun but wrong. Explosions don't roar in space. There's no air to carry sound, so that giant fireball would be a silent flash, and without atmosphere to shape flames, debris would burst outward in every direction, then fade as gases disperse. Filmmakers add thunder because silence feels wrong, but the vacuum is quiet, and that quiet is eerie in a good way. Hacking isn't a 12-second montage. Real intrusions start with recon, mapping services, version numbers, credential leaks, phishing for access, then careful privilege escalation. You chain exploits, pivot between machines, hide in logs, and move slowly to avoid alarms. The Iman moment is usually weeks of groundwork and a boring password reused from a breach site. DNA isn't an absolute fingerprint in the courtroom sense. A match is a statistical statement with probabilities and confidence intervals. Partial profiles, lab contamination, mixed samples from multiple people. These complicate conclusions. Analysts compare loci and compute likelihood ratios. It's powerful but not magic, and scenes that treat a single hair as infallible evidence oversell certainty. Laser beams don't naturally paint glowing lines across rooms. You see a beam only when particles in the air scatter light into your eyes, dust, smoke, fog. In clean air, a laser is invisible except at the source and the point of impact. That crisscrossed red web in a pristine vault, add a fog machine and sure, otherwise it's mostly movie mood lighting. Evolution isn't a time-lapse hero shot that gives someone gills by midnight. Evolution is change in genetic variation across generations, driven by selection, drift, mutation, and gene flow. Mutations don't guarantee better, they trade fitness across environments. You can adapt bacteria quickly because generations are minutes, humans take decades. Rapid adaptation exists, instant superpowers don't. And let's correct the defibrillator trope one more time because repetition matters. You shock chaotic rhythms like VF and pulseless VT. You don't shock a flatline. Good CPR, oxygenation, and fixing the cause, hypoxia, hypothermia, hypovolemia, electrolytes, save lives. Movies love paddles because sparks sell, but the checklist is the real hero. Now car chases. Bullets hitting a fuel tank rarely create a cinematic fireball. Gasoline needs vapor air mixing with inflammable limits and an ignition source. Modern tanks are baffled, often plastic and placed away from easy sparks. Cars do catch fire, but it's usually post-crash heat, ruptured lines, or electrical faults, not a single ricochet turning a sedan into a bomb. Instantly enhancing a fuzzy photo to perfect clarity breaks physics. Resolution depends on captured information. You can denoise, sharpen edges, or infer missing pixels with AI models trained on similar images, but you can't pull license plate numbers from a handful of blurry blocks if those details were never recorded. Interpolation guesses, it doesn't time travel. Silencers, really suppressors, don't whisper. A suppressed 9 with subsonic ammo still sits around lawnmower loud. The crack from supersonic rounds remains. They reduce blast, recoil, and flash, making shooters more effective and neighbors less deaf, but they don't turn rooftop firefights into stealth sequences where nobody hears a thing 2 floors down. Car airbags aren't reusable cushions. They deploy once explosively and vent immediately through woven seams to prevent secondary injuries. Movie characters punch an inflated bag like a balloon. In reality, it's milliseconds of gas, talc dust, heat, and then a deflated sack. Also, airbags pair with seatbelts. The belt positions your body so the bag works. Vent shafts aren't human highways. Most can't support body weight, have sharp screws and sheet metal edges, and change directions with tight turns. HVAC paths are obstructed by filters, dampers, and fans. Real infiltration uses doors, badges, and social engineering at the front desk, not gymnastics in dust tunnels. Medical wake up from coma and rip out the IV scene, skip ICU reality. Long comas cause muscle atrophy, waking is often gradual with delirium and rehab. Pulling lines risks bleeding and infection. Staff prevent that with mitts, alarms, and protocols. Drama is slower, but it's how bodies actually recover. Forensic time of death nailed to the minute from one poke. Core temperature, rigor mortis, lividity, insect activity, and environmental conditions only bracket a window. Airflow, clothing, body fat, humidity, even surface contact change the clock. Precision improves with scene context and lab analysis. It's never a wrist-touch revelation. Phone tracing doesn't require keep them talking for 60 seconds. Landline error limitations are gone. Call detail records, cell tower logs, GPS from apps, Wi-Fi association histories. Modern systems place devices fast, sometimes without a live call at all. The long stall trope is a fossil from analog switching. And yes, enhance the audio is bounded too. You can isolate frequencies, separate sources with beamforming or machine learning, and improve intelligibility. But if the signal is buried below noise with no redundancy, you hit a wall. Algorithms can't recover words that never rose above the hiss. Microstory, a security team investigates a breach. No cinematic terminal rain. They pull logs, correlate timestamps, diff hashes, replay traffic captures, and discover a contractor's compromised VPN. One phishing email, 2-factor prompt bombing, session hijack. They rotate keys, segment networks, and write a lessons learned. Quiet, effective, and real. Here's the bigger point: physics, biology, and security have constraints. Movies bend them for pace. That's fine for fun, just don't let the fiction overwrite your mental model. Famous figures also get the myth treatment. Let's correct the record next. 14 miscast icons, from Cleopatra to Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette didn't say let them eat cake. The line appears in earlier sources, pinned to other nobles as a caricature of elite cluelessness. It stuck to Marie because the revolution needed a symbol, and she was foreign, visible, and easy to hate. Her real letters show budget worries, charity efforts, and political missteps, not pastry taunts. The myth survives because it's a perfect meme, one sentence that explains an entire revolution's anger. Reality is messier: bad harvests, debt from wars, regressive taxes, and a court failing to reform. Napoleon wasn't tiny. He stood roughly 56 to 57 in modern units average for French men of his era. Confusion comes from French inches, British cartoons, and the habit of surrounding emperors with tall guards. Enemies weaponized the little corporal nickname to belittle him. He leaned into it as a populist brand. The point isn't his height, it's how propaganda frames perception. He reorganized law with the Napoleonic Code, modernized administration, and fought coalitions across Europe, none of which require a stepladder joke to understand. Spartans weren't flawless warrior philosophers. They built strength on a caste system that enslaved helots who farmed under threat and revolt. Spartan education produced disciplined soldiers, but it also narrowed cultural horizons, limited arts, strict social control, and a brittle economy. Their victories were real, yet their state struggled with demographics and inflexibility. When sources praising Sparta are often outsiders with agendas, treat the hype like a gym brochure, impressive but selective. The romantic 300 lens erases the thousands of support staff, allies, and the coercive society backstage. Joan of Arc wasn't a barefoot visionary wandering unarmored through arrows. She wore commissioned armor, carried a banner, and drove strategy by focusing French efforts on relieving besieged towns and forcing open-field engagements under favorable terms. She didn't swing a sword in slow motion every scene. She rallied morale, pushed momentum, and respected logistics, bridges, boats, artillery placement. Her trial records reveal a sharp mind navigating traps. The story is faith and nerve meeting practical command, not mystical invulnerability. Saladin gets painted as pure chivalry, handshakes, and kind words to crusaders. He was courteous at times and pragmatic often. He wove coalitions, used truces to regroup, and pressed advantages ruthlessly when needed. After Hatton, he ransomed or executed selectively based on politics and message sending. Mercy wasn't universal, it was a tool. Seeing him only as the noble enemy flattens a leader balancing legitimacy across fractious emirs, war finances, and a holy city in the crosshairs. Respect his reputation but keep the edges. Genghis Khan wasn't just a whirlwind of slaughter. Yes, his conquests were brutally coercive, with massacres as strategic terror. But he also codified laws in the Yassa, promoted merit over lineage, protected trade along the Silk Roads, and tolerated religions as long as they paid and obeyed. His couriers sped information, his census-taking fed taxation and logistics. The empire's scale came from administrative innovations that let small corps command distant frontiers. Violence opened doors, institutions kept them from slamming shut. Back to Cleopatra because casting keeps lying. She wasn't a spell-casting siren who toppled Rome with eyeliner. She was a multilingual ruler managing grain exports, budgets, and diplomacy between feuding Roman factions. Aligning with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony wasn't just romance, it was grand strategy to keep Egypt sovereign. Coins show her with pragmatic features, not Hollywood glamour propaganda for domestic and foreign audiences. She played identity shrewdly. Greek lineage, Egyptian presentation, and court theatrics tuned to each audience she needed. Let me show you how these miscasts work. Step 1, pick a simple trait, cake, height, horns on helmets but for people. Step 2, repeat it until it explains everything. Step 3, strip out context that complicates the meme. It's clean and wrong. Marie becomes decadent arrogance, Napoleon becomes insecurity, Spartans become discipline incarnate without oppression, Joan becomes miracle without logistics, Saladin becomes gentleman without realpolitik, Genghis becomes monster without statecraft, Cleopatra becomes seduction without governance. Cute stories, bad history. Micro story, a visitor to a Paris exhibit sees Marie's inventory lists, linen counts, fees for orphans, payments to suppliers. Boring, that's monarchy administration. You can't reconcile those spreadsheets with the cake quip unless you accept that propaganda devours nuance. The visitor leaves more interested in how slogans beat receipts. Another angle, selective sources. Most of what we know about Sparta comes from later writers admiring or critiquing it. Joan's life threads through a hostile court transcript that still shows her composure. Saladin's legend benefits from both Muslim chroniclers and Western writers who needed a noble counterpart. Genghis emerges from court histories that justify rule. Cleopatra's image rides Roman authors invested in painting Antony's partner as dangerous. When the camera is in the enemy's hands, expect framing. Here's what actually helps: follow material culture and paperwork. Coins reveal how leaders wanted to be seen. Laws expose priorities. Logistics records, grain shipments, horse quotas, tax receipts tell you what leaders really cared about. For Spartans, Helot rebellions and land transfers show the cost of their model. For Genghis, postal relays, weights and measures, and merchant protections explain commercial resilience. For Joan, armor orders and pay rolls prove a professional apparatus around her. So why do films cling to the myths? They're fast. A queen who quips about cake, a tiny tyrant with a complex, a saintly Muslim general, a super soldier society, a peasant girl surrounded by halos, a barbarian scourge, a seductress queen, each sells a poster in seconds. But the real people are more interesting. They navigated budgets, factions, famine, cavalry remounts, siege trains, and treaties. They compromised, failed, pivoted, and sometimes won for reasons that don't fit on a t-shirt. One last correction on Marie. The line that's closest in spirit comes from Rousseau quoting an unnamed great princess. It's a philosophical setup, not a transcript. That's your red flag for half of history's best quotes. They often debut as arguments, not reportage. If a line is too perfect, verify. The payoff of ditching miscasts is simple. You get better tools to read power, how image shapes policy, how propaganda survives, and how logistics outmuscle legend. Famous figures don't need costume myths to be compelling. They were already wrestling real constraints. Final set, small lies that spread everywhere through pop culture are next. 15 everyday myths movies taught you. Silencers don't make guns whisper. A good suppressor with subsonic ammo tames the blast, cuts the muzzle flash, and makes recoil easier to manage, but we're still talking loud power tool territory. Add mechanical noise from the action and a supersonic crack if you're not using subsonics, and anyone nearby still hears it. The real advantage is control and confusion, not invisibility. That's why militaries love cans for team communication and preserving hearing, not for spy movie silence in a marble hallway. Bullets don't turn cars into fireballs. Gasoline needs vapor mixed with air and an ignition source in the right ratio. Modern tanks are baffled plastic tucked away from hot components, and bullets usually make neat holes, not sparks and fumes cocktails. Cars burn after crashes when heat ruptured lines or electrical shorts meet pooled fuel. If you see a sedan explode from a pistol shot, you're in fiction. Real hazards are leaks and fire spread, not instant cinematic napalm. Quicksand isn't a death vacuum. It's water-saturated sand that liquefies when disturbed, increasing drag. Your body's average density is close to water, so you tend to float with your lungs full. Thrash and you sink deeper slowly, relax and you rise. Extraction is technique, shed heavy gear, spread weight, lean back and move one leg at a time to create space for water to flow in. It's exhausting, not inevitable doom. In short, patience beats panic. Those red laser tripwires crisscrossing vaults. Security sensors are more boring and effective. Infrared beams exist, but you'll also find pressure mats, magnetometers, microwave volumetrics, LiDAR presence detection, dual-tech motion sensors that require heat and movement together, and sealed-loop circuits on doors. Many systems are invisible by design, layered with tamper monitoring and zone logic that alarms if two adjacent sensors trip out of sequence. The fog machine maze is set dressing. The real danger is the sensor you can't see. Computer progress bars don't measure time linearly. They're estimates based on chunks the program can forecast. Some steps finish fast, others stall on I/O or network latency, and the bar jumps or crawls accordingly. Developers often pad the early portion to show movement and keep users calm, then hit unknowns. That 99% hang, finalization, cache writes, virus scan hooks. Treat bars as vibes, not promises. If you want truth, watch throughput, not the blue rectangle. Keep them talking so we can trace the call belongs to rotary switches. Modern networks log call metadata instantly. Cell phones constantly handshake with towers. Location can be triangulated or read from GPS and Wi-Fi databases that apps ping all day. Even without a live call, carriers can provide historical pings and timing advanced data. Law enforcement still needs legal process, but the tech doesn't need 60 seconds of small talk to wake up. Lockpicking is not a 2-second paperclip flick. Real locks use security pins, tolerances, sidebars, and restricted keyways. With skill and tools, many can be picked, sure, but it takes feedback, time, and practice. High-security locks resist traditional picks and require specialized approaches or destructive entry. And plenty of doors are defeated by simpler tactics, shimming a latch, bypassing an exposed reader, or social engineering the person with the key. The fastest pick is often a clipboard and confidence. Knocking someone out with a single bonk for a tidy nap is pure fantasy. Concussions cause brain injury, vomiting, memory gaps, and can be fatal. If someone does lose consciousness, they don't wake up crisp 10 minutes later with no symptoms. Real fights are messy, clinches, trips, adrenaline, and more injuries to hands than jaws. That's why pros train control holds and multiple-person tactics. Tidy sleep isn't a strategy, it's a plot device. Vent shafts aren't human highways. Most ducts can't hold body weight, are filled with sharp screws and turning vanes, and include fans that will happily make you regret your choices. They also route through filters and fire dampers that block passage. Real intrusions use doors, badges, tailgating, and device cloning. If an attacker is in a ceiling, they're usually crawling on joists above a drop ceiling grid, not surfing an HVAC tunnel like an action hero mole. Hack the mainframe in 30 seconds skips the entire kill chain. Attackers start with recon, open ports, software versions, employee names, cloud assets. They fish, harvest credentials, and try a low and slow lateral move. Privilege escalation relies on misconfigurations, token theft, Kerber roasting, or abusing insecure service accounts. Then they stage data, exfiltrate, and clean logs. The drama happens in emails and endpoint telemetry, not neon terminals and clacking keyboards. Car doors aren't bulletproof shields. Most handguns punch through sheet metal and interior trim, rifle rounds tear through easily. Engine blocks, wheel hubs, and pillars provide partial cover, the rest is concealment at best. That's why training teaches angles, distance, and using the engine bay, not hunkering behind a door like it's a medieval tower. A trunk full of paper won't save you either. People don't fly backward when shot. Physics says momentum transfer is small compared to body mass. The dramatic launch comes from the actor, not the bullet. Real impact looks like flinch, stumble, collapse, or no immediate visible reaction at all, especially under adrenaline. Expect delayed responses, not wire-fu physics. And with knives, the danger zone is short and chaotic, no tidy telegraphing from across the room. CPR always works is a harmful myth. High-quality CPR doubles or triples survival for shockable rhythms and buys time for defibrillation and advanced care. But success rates outside hospitals are still modest and depend on early recognition, bystander action, and quick EMS. Broken ribs can happen and aren't a you did it wrong sign. Compressions need depth. Learn the real steps, push hard and fast, let the chest recoil, minimize pauses, and use an AAD as soon as it arrives. Glass cuts like butter is also off. Movie glass is sugar glass. Real tempered glass shatters into pellets designed to reduce lacerations, while laminated windshields stay bonded with plastic. Breaking them is loud, messy, and tool-intensive. Center punches, rescue hammers, or saws. Diving through a closed window in a tux without bleeding is pure stunt. Electrocute the fence with a car battery won't zap a squad. Voltage and current delivery matter, as does grounding and contact. A 12-volt car battery can't push lethal current through intact human skin without special circumstances. Meanwhile, real electrified fences use pulsed high voltage with low energy designed to deter, not kill. Improvised movie traps ignore insulation, circuit paths, and the fact that dry shoes are better than most plot armor. Micro-story, a heist team practices the lasers in a smoky warehouse. The real pro tags along, yawns, and spends 3 days photographing door hardware, sniffing networks, and profiling guard habits. On game day, they walk in dressed as contractors with a forged work order, clone a badge, and leave with a rolling Pelican case before lunch. Zero flips, maximum paperwork. Here's the pattern: movies trade accuracy for pace, fine for popcorn, terrible for your mental model. Treat suppressors as mufflers, not cloaks. Treat quicksand with calm, not panic. Treat security as layers, not red lines. Treat tech as systems, not magic. Transition, remember that one lie I teased. Here's the one almost everyone repeats without thinking. 16, the one you definitely believe. People in the Middle Ages died at 30. You've heard it, you've said it, movies repeat it like a punchline. Here's what actually happens when you look at the numbers. Life expectancy at birth is not a cap on human lifespan. It's an average crushed downward by infant and child mortality. If lots of kids die before age 5, the average plummets, even if many adults who survive childhood go on to live into their 60s or more. Let me show you the math quickly. Imagine 10 people, 4 die before age 5, the other 6 reach 60. The average might hover around 34, but that doesn't mean adults keeled over at 34. It means the early deaths drag the mean down. Demographers use survivorship curves to illustrate this. Steep drop early, then a long tail for those who make it past the childhood gauntlet. That pattern shows up in parish registers, burial records, and skeletal analyses across Europe. Parish records from late medieval and early modern towns list baptisms, marriages, and burials. Track a birth cohort, and you'll see a spike of deaths in the first years: fever, diarrhea, respiratory disease, malnutrition during bad harvests. But follow the survivors and a different picture appears. Routine ages of 50s and 60s for many, 70s for some, even 80s for a fortunate few. Skeletons back this up. Osteologists identify age markers, dental wear, bone fusion, vertebral changes, and consistently find a spread that includes middle-aged and older adults, not a cemetery full of 30-year-olds. So why does the myth stick? Because average age 30 is a seductive shorthand that compresses complexity into a single number. Movies love it because it telegraphs brutal past in a second. Give your hero a 25th birthday and a line like "I'm practically elderly," and you've set tone without showing hard context. Infant mortality, epidemics, famine cycles, sanitation limits, and women's risks in childbirth. But shorthand isn't truth. Now, what did actually shorten adult lives? Epidemics hit in waves, plague in the 14th century and after, smallpox, typhus, influenza. Famine clustered around climate shocks and crop failures. Violence and accidents mattered but weren't daily death for everyone. Occupational hazards scarred bodies: weavers with lung issues, miners with trauma, farmers with joint degeneration, soldiers with healed fractures and embedded metal. Yet after the worst disease years, communities rebounded, and adults who avoided infection or survived it carried on. Women faced additional risk during childbirth, yes. Maternal mortality was higher than today, but again, not universal doom. Midwifery traditions, community knowledge, and later early modern obstetric shifts gradually improved odds. Fertility patterns mattered, spacing births increased survival, malnutrition and infection raised danger. You don't see any of that nuance in a screenwriter's joke about old at 30. Here's where it gets interesting. Life expectancy rises dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries, mostly because child survival improves. Clean water, sewer systems, vaccination, pasteurization, better nutrition, later antibiotics. Adult lifespans improve too, but the biggest single lever is fewer funerals for toddlers. Once you know that, you start reading historical numbers correctly instead of repeating a myth that insults both the dead and the living. Micro-story, a village ledger from the 1500s lists a man born in 1468, still paying taxes in 1535, then handing property to a son in 1540. He worked, aged, and strategized about inheritance. He wasn't a unicorn, he was part of that survivorship tale. Meanwhile, the ledger also shows several infants baptized and buried within a year, tragedies that skew averages. Both realities coexist on the same page. Skeletal evidence reinforces this duality. Cemetery samples show enamel hypoplasias, stress lines from childhood illness or malnutrition, but also remodeled bone from healed fractures, arthritic changes consistent with decades of labor, and dental wear patterns pointing to long chewing lifetimes. Healed injuries prove survival, arthritis proves time. You can't develop severe osteoarthritis by 29 then disappear. Those joints took decades of use. So what do we do with the myth? We replace it with precision. Say, average life expectancy at birth was low due to high infant mortality. Adults who survived childhood often lived into their 50s or 60s and some longer. Say, crisis years pushed mortality up. Stable decades let families accumulate age. Say, women faced childbirth risks. Surviving mothers often reached later decades. These sentences teach more than a punchline ever will. Why does this matter beyond being pedantic? Because it calibrates your sense of progress. If you think everyone dropped at 30, you miss how transformative clean water, vaccination, and nutrition really were. You also miss the agency of past people planning long-term, granting apprenticeships that lasted 7 years, arranging marriage portions, writing wills with provisions for grandchildren. People invest when they expect years ahead. The records show exactly that. It also changes how you read old. In many periods, 40 could be socially old for manual labor or childbirth, but not biologically near death. Aging was visible, fewer teeth, joint pain, cataracts, but communities adapted with roles. Elders judged disputes, managed property, and taught crafts. Respect or neglect depended on culture and economics, not a biological cliff at 30. Here's a neat test for spotting bad history writing. If an author quotes a single life expectancy 30 number without specifying at birth, at age 5, or at age 20, be skeptical. Proper demography always states the starting age. Life expectancy at age 20 in many pre-modern populations could be 2 to 4 more decades depending on time and place. That's a completely different world from the mean. Close the loop. The next time someone says they died at 30, you can answer, no, they averaged low because kids died. Adults commonly lived into their 60s. The real changes came from saving children. It's a cleaner explanation, and it points to the real heroes of modern longevity: water, vaccines, calories, and sanitation. One last angle: movies cling to 30 because it simplifies makeup and casting. You can staff a medieval village with 20-somethings and call it realistic if the audience believes nobody gets old. But the past had wrinkles, stooped backs, and gray hair. It had grandmothers teaching bread and grandfathers mending tools. Let them exist on screen and the world feels real. Quick recap so it sticks. Average at birth is not adult lifespan. Survivorship curves matter. Records and bones prove elderhood existed. Modern gains come from child survival first, adult medicine second. Calibrate that in your head and 1,000 other myths start to wobble. One last thing before you go. Here's the takeaway. Movies compress everything into neat tropes. But the real past is systems, trade-offs, and people solving problems over time. If you want more myth-busting you can use in arguments, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Drop a comment with the one fact you still hear at parties that needs a correction. And if you're ready for a deeper dive, watch the next video where I break down the geopolitical paradoxes shaping today's map.